My name is Steve Bingham and I'm a violinist and educator from the UK. I'm here in Poland to talk about a variety of pieces by PWM Edition as part of their Music from Chopin's Land series. We've arrived at Wieniawski, and of course, for non-Polish musicians, he's one of the composers that everybody is aware of, particularly if you're a violinist. Of the many violin pieces he wrote, some of which are very, very popular, I decided to try to find one that I'd not come across before. And in the PWM Edition, the Most Beautiful series, in one of the volumes of Wieniawski pieces, there is this wonderful Kujawiak in A minor. This is a type of Polish dance, a traditional dance. I looked it up and I'm told that there are 5 main types of Polish dance. We all know mazurkas, but a Kujawiak is another one of these, which is in many ways quite similar, comes from a central region of the country. And like a mazurka, it's in triple time, in 3 beats of the bar, with strong accents on the third and sometimes the second beat of the bar. And you'll hear the particularly third beat accents in the excerpt we're going to play to you. It's usually in a minor key and maybe a little bit freer than a mazurka. And this Wieniawski example has that freedom of tempo right from the beginning. The piano starts with this introduction to the theme, which is really pulled around. And this is a chance for a student to explore their own musicality, because they can't just play what's on the page. There are pauses and there are changes of tempo, and it needs to have their musical input to really work. So it's quite an advanced concept, but a very good one for students to play. And it's a good introduction to Wieniawski, because it's a lot easier than some of his pieces. So we're going to play you the opening section of the piece, just to give you a feel for this rubato feel and also the dance feel, which actually the composer marks tempo mazurka. I think maybe there's some crossover here between dances. Maybe he's not sure which dance it is. So you can immediately hear in the fast tempo mazurka section those third beat accents. It's a great way to introduce your students to these big double stop. The bowing that's marked in this part is very helpful. So it's suggesting a starting on an up bow, so that the accented note on the third beat is on a down bow, and so on. But I would also recommend that students practice it the other way around, because it's really good to be able to get those accents on an up bow as well. so that they've got more control over both types of bowing. They're bowings that are going to be very useful in lots of other pieces, particularly the dotted rhythms. And so it's worth a student spending time trying these different options and seeing which they prefer and maybe which they're not as good at, so that they can work on those sides of things. There are a few specific things to look at in this piece. There's quite a lot of little ornaments, turns, and trills. It's always worth thinking that they don't need to be rushed. So when you have that turn at the beginning of a trill, don't just play it as fast as you can. That loses the musical feel. Even within a trill is not a competition to see how fast you can go. Maybe sometimes that works, but often here it's worth changing the speed of the trill. And I also normally recommend that at the end of a trill, particularly in this case where there's a little turn at the end of it, that you have a moment of stillness where you're not trilling, where the underlying note comes through. So if we look at that particular trill in slow motion, we've got the turn into it. There's the actual note. Then we start trilling a little bit under speed, maybe speed it up, then stop, and then play and then the turn to go on. So when you put all those things together, it gives a little more, I think, a little more expression into a bar like that. Just a little bit of room, a little bit of space in there. The next few bars have some big dynamic changes. So we have, it's marked on the E string, forte, and then on the A string to a harmonic, pianissimo. Those sort of big dynamic changes can be quite hard in terms of bow control. So I would suggest that you get students to play them completely separately with a big gap in between. So they practice getting the feel of the loud note, a gap, and then just separate out the elements, and then when they're comfortable with how they feel with bow weight and so on, then put them together. There's a passage later on in the piece with alternating pizzicato chords with bowed arco chords. It's the main theme of the piece, and it just lends variety to this tune. Again, it's worth a student approaching this quite slowly at first. And one of the things that I would suggest they do is to play it all bowed first, and maybe even all pits. So play it all with the bow to get the feel of where the hand patterns need to go. Maybe play it all plucked. And only then, when they've got the feel for that, put it together, making sure that they're in the right part of the bow. 2 up bows. So you travel after the plucking to about there, so you've got enough room to do. The end of the piece is also tricky. The composer uses false harmonics, and there's a little scale of them. One thing to point out with this, in the edition, there's a suggested fingering, but I would also want a student to look at an alternative. So we've got this little chromatic scale. And the final harmonic there of that section of the scale is marked on the E string as a natural harmonic. And for some players that will work really well because then they're ready for the last few harmonics after it. But for me, I would also look at keeping that harmonic as a false one on the A string. And then changing to the E string. So it's a slight variation on what's printed in the part, but worth trying. This piece is a great introduction to Wieniawski for a student who is perhaps not quite ready for many of those more popular but much harder pieces. But if they enjoy this, they can have a look at some of the other works within this PWM Edition volume. There's a real variety and some very tricky pieces. But this one is going to also push them at whatever level they are in terms of the rubato. They're getting the feel of the music and the feel of the tempo and the specific technical things that we've talked about, such as the alternating between pizzicato and arco chords and the tricky harmonics at the end. It's a great piece for a student to work on this style of playing.